Kia ora. Welcome to this third dialogue session of CCSAG. I think we will be having a very interesting topic tonight. But before we start on topic, a brief note about our dialogue sessions. The Climate Change Sustainability Action Group was formed in April 2021. I'm the lead. My name is Pravindra Mukhya. Since its formation, we have been advocating application of sustainability principles through our many in-person talks and virtual sessions. So what do we want to achieve through this dialogue series? Only one thing, actually. We are empowering ourselves, the project managers, with the knowledge to do the right things right. And today's topic is Aotearoa New Zealand Climate Standards, a guide for project managers. We have a main speaker, Dr. Amelia Sharman. If you could kindly raise your hand. And we have our two esteemed panelists, Tony Moore and Gina Barlow. Tony is the principal advisor of climate resilience of the Christchurch City Council. Gina is experienced program management consultant and a CCSAG member. But finally, this dialogue session is about your participation, which is very, very important. There is a Q&A session after 30 minutes. Do raise your hand or send me a chat note, and I shall invite you to participate. So I'm very much looking forward to a rich dialogue session. I shall now welcome Dr. Amelia to make a presentation.
Thank you very much, Prawindra. I'm really delighted to be here today. So what I'll do is I'll just share my screen so you can see my slides. Okay, hoping that that's come through now. So yes, thank you so much for having me. I'm really delighted to be here today to talk to you all about climate-related disclosures. As Prawindra said, I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes. I've got heaps of slides, so I might skip through some of them, but I wanted them to be there for you as a slide pack after the event, if that was helpful. So firstly, who is the XRB? You might not have heard about us. We are an independent Crown entity which develops and issues accounting, audit and assurance, and climate reporting standards. And these standards are used by entities across the private, public, and not-for-profit sectors. And that's our vision statement there on the screen. And what am I going to talk to you about today? I've got three things. Firstly, we're going to talk about Aotearoa New Zealand climate standards and some key things to look out for as a project manager. Secondly, assurance of greenhouse gas emissions. And thirdly, some guidance that can support entities as they're disclosing against these standards. So firstly, the standards. But before we begin, I'd really like to talk about why we think the disclosures are important. So yes, there is a legislative requirement in New Zealand. It is mandatory for climate reporting entities, and I'll talk about who they are, to produce climate statements. But we really want to emphasise that this legislative requirement does enable two other key outcomes. Firstly, it's about better decision-making by investors so that they can make more informed decisions about the climate-related risks and opportunities facing the entities and sectors into which they invest. And secondly, critically, it's about better strategy by the entities themselves, as these disclosures encourage entities to think about their strategic choices in light of the risks and opportunities of climate change. So who are these climate reporting entities that I talked about? These are identified in primary legislation. The XRB says what they need to report. The primary legislation always says who needs to report. So climate reporting entities are identified in legislation as either large listed debt and equity issuers, which is the ones on the left, and large financial organisations, so the banks, insurers, KiwiSaver fund managers, etc. on the right. It will also cover some large Crown financial institutions such as ACC and New Zealand Super Fund, but that's based on a letter of expectation from the Minister of Finance. We issued the standards in December last year, and we made them effective from 1 January this year. And there are some assurance requirements, which I will talk about in part 2 of this presentation. So what are the disclosures? What do the standards say? So we were enabled to issue a climate-related disclosure framework, and we decided that this framework should be made up of 3 standards, and collectively they are known as Aotearoa New Zealand climate standards. And they are based on that very well-known international framework, which is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD, which you might have heard about. And so those TCFD themes of governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets, they are the basis for pretty much all climate-related disclosure requirements internationally. And, we use them too. And so that is really helping with that international alignment of the requirements. The thing that we did do a bit differently in New Zealand is we put a clear purpose statement into the standards, and that's in that speech bubble there on the slide. And this purpose statement is in each of the standards because we really wanted preparers, so entities, to have this front and centre when they're thinking about implementing the standards. So it's really about, we want these standards to achieve change. We want them to achieve that transition to a low emissions, climate resilient future. They're not performance standards. It's not about a pass or fail checklist, black and white, you've done X, or you need to achieve a certain level of performance. It's all about disclosure. What is the entity doing so that the users of that information, the investors, can make better decisions as well. So I'll do a very brief overview of the 3 standards and what they cover. So first we have climate-related disclosures, or NZCS1, and that's where the 4 main disclosure areas, governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets are housed. It also identifies the scope of the mandatory assurance that's required over greenhouse gas emissions. I won't go through all of these aspects now, but I will be pulling out a couple of these disclosure requirements where I think project managers can make a really big difference in terms of how they help entities with their disclosures. Based on feedback we received, we also heard that some of the disclosure requirements were quite challenging, and so what we did was we wrote this adoption standard, and this gives some short-term relief to some of the disclosures of a year. That's adoption provisions 1, 2, 3, and 4, and also, we realised that people couldn't provide comparative information until they'd been reporting for a few years. And finally, we have this general requirement standard, which is NZCS3, and this is a really, really crucial standard. I really encourage every entity or anyone working on this topic to make sure they know this standard really well, because it houses both the principles for disclosure and the general requirements. And this is, what is material to disclose, what methods and assumptions of disclosures are required. It's based on this overarching principle of fair presentation. It has these information presentation principles, and then, as I said, the general requirements. And I'll talk through value chain very shortly and what that means. I'd also point out, if you're not familiar with standards, every standard is accompanied by what's called a basis for conclusions, and that's intended to provide really useful explanations of our decision-making process during the standards development. So if you're not sure about why we did something, you can always look in that. And standards also have defined terms, and these are an integral part of the standard. So we really do encourage anyone who's not sure, what do these terms mean, be aware that there are defined terms in the standards themselves. We developed Aotearoa New Zealand climate standards in a really busy and fluid global context. So since we issued the standards in December last year, the International Sustainability Standards Board, which some of you might have heard of, issued their standards. And we have just this week actually issued a comparison document between our standards and their standards. And the main message from that is that there is good alignment between the standards because we all use those core TCFD areas. But however, their standards are quite a bit more specific and detailed than ours. Ours are more higher level and principles based. And so we purposely designed ours that way to take account for the relatively smaller entities in this regime, and also to really encourage entities to think about the intent of the disclosures, that kind of strategic learning, rather than necessary, a whole lot of list of tick box compliance. So, but the key message I want to leave you with from this slide, however, is that, while there's a heap of international activity at both at an international level and at different jurisdictions in New Zealand, Aotearoa New Zealand climate standards are the domestic requirements, and they will remain so until we do what's called a post-implementation review, and we will begin that by the end of 2025. So how can you help as a project manager? For some entities that haven't thought about climate-related risks and opportunities before, we know that undertaking this work is a really, really big task. And it also requires the coordination of multiple parts of an organisation, from the highest governance levels through to various aspects of risk, legal, investor relations strategy, etc. And it's not only achieving that goal of producing a climate statement, that legislative requirement, but really it's we're really encouraging entities to think about doing so in a way that actually achieves value for the entity rather than being seen as a compliance exercise. Because really, we're clear that it would be a huge waste of any entity's time and resources to go through all of this work and not get any strategic gain out of it. So I thought today I'd give you two examples of requirements in the standards that will require excellent project management input. And the first is the value chain. So in that NZCS3, the General Requirement Standard, we have a requirement that climate-related risks and opportunities relate to activities, interactions, and relationships, and to the use of resources along an entity's value chain. When considering its exposure to climate-related risks and opportunities, an entity must consider the exposure of its value chain as well. So, as I said before, there are defined terms. So what do we mean by a value chain? It's a reasonably long defined term, but it begins with this sentence, which is the full range of activities, resources, relationships related to the entity's business model and the external environment in which it operates. It's, we're really trying to be quite expansive with this concept. So as a project manager, what you can do is help the entity to systematically identify and understand its value chain to start with, and then assess the risks and opportunities along that value chain. And these can be what are called physical risks and opportunities, or transition risks and opportunities. And, I remember hearing the then CEO of Z Energy several years ago talking about doing voluntary climate-related disclosures. And he said, the biggest benefit that they got at that point was even just understanding what their value chain was, let alone necessarily what the risks and opportunities were alongside it. So there's understanding your risks and opportunities in your value chain, but another aspect of the value chain requirement is the greenhouse gas emissions disclosures. So entities have to disclose scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions that are material, and any emissions that are material must be disclosed and then assured from 2024. And there are many methodologies and standards that an entity can use. We do not prescribe which measurement standard an entity uses. They can just determine which measurement standard it deems fit. And project managers can do a really important job here, which is breaking down what might seem to be a huge task, which is to understand all of the emissions. Understand what are your emissions, what will be material to your primary user, how you go about, identifying and estimating those emissions. There are some really great tools to get started. We link some of these in our basic greenhouse gas emissions fact sheet on our website, such as the MFE, Ministry for the Environment, worksheets on greenhouse gas emissions. They're a really good place to get started. And emissions measurement is also about being more specific and precise over time. So you can start with just basic revenue information, and then you get more precise. And so that is also an important job for a project manager in terms of encouraging continuous improvement in terms of these disclosures. What I would say, however, at this point, that it is important to remember that the standard does not force the provision of information up to a climate reporting entity from an entity in its value chain. So, for example, a property owner that's being given capital by a bank is not forced by our standards to provide greenhouse gas emissions to that bank. However, the bank may decide to make the provision of that information a condition of capital, so that they can more accurately fulfill their own disclosure requirements. So it is the entity's choice as to whether or not they want to compel that information. And then the next one I'll give you is scenario analysis, which is a really important part of the strategy disclosures. Scenario analysis, climate-related scenario analysis in this context, is primarily a tool to enhance strategic thinking. on climate-related risks and opportunities. And what it is, it's a process for systematically exploring the effects of a range of plausible future events under conditions of uncertainty. We use the analogy of a plane in a wind tunnel. The business model and strategy of an entity is the plane. It's going into that wind tunnel. It needs to really understand how it's going to be resilient to all the things, that those extremes of climate that are being thrown at it. And what we found by talking to lots of entities is that generally entities start their climate-related disclosure journey by doing some sort of gap analysis against the disclosures. So they say, do we talk about it at governance? What are our management processes? What are our risk management processes? But then a key next step is often the scenario analysis, because that can be a way for entities to kind of get into thinking about risks and opportunities. And scenario analysis requires the participation of a range of people across an entity, and really importantly, it does require buy-in from that highest level governance body. So we've released scenario analysis guidance recently as well. It's on our website. And we think that project managers could play a really important job in terms of coordinating entities to approach this 6-step process that we outline in our guidance. And then the scenario analysis work, and all of the disclosures really are designed to lead to an entity's transition planning. This is translating really all of the learning that an entity has done in terms of its climate-related disclosures into so what are we going to do about it? And that's the essence of transition planning. How is that entity's strategy going to change based on everything that it's learned? Now, I'm aware that some of you here today might not be in a climate reporting entity. So what I thought I'd do is talk about entities who might want to think about voluntarily applying the climate standards. So firstly, really it's that know your number. We are clear that greenhouse gas emissions information is becoming a fundamental piece of organisational data. So we're really encouraging entities to think about their emissions. Secondly, it's about engaging with key stakeholders. So there are a lot of stakeholders, suppliers, regulators, investors, lenders, etc., that entities can engage with if they want to develop and implement a strong and climate resilient strategy. Thirdly, it's about thinking about how you intend to really strategically position yourself in terms of that context of the change. So the world is going to change around you. What is your strategy going to be to respond to that change? Think about, identify and prioritize your risks, which ones are the most material for you, and then think about targets. What emissions reduction targets can you identify that are ambitious and credible? So, excuse me, the second thing I was going to talk to you about today is assurance. So in the standards in the primary legislation, it identified that assurance was required of a greenhouse gas emissions disclosure. So we've been doing a lot of work to help entities and assurance practitioners more specifically get ready for this. So assurance is a really important process that enhances trust and confidence in information being disclosed. So in these circles, you can see step one, we've got a sound reporting framework. So that's what we're hoping that the climate standards have provided. There also needs to be strong governance. So climate reporting entities need to prepare detailed supporting records and put in place sound management functions and controls, and that might include things like internal audit. The Financial Markets Authority that regulates these disclosures have put out record keeping guidance. So if you are an entity that is required to report, I really recommend that you have a look at that. And then, an entity may decide to obtain some external professional advice because some of these topics are quite specific, greenhouse gas emissions, scenario analysis, etc. And so these factors build in the entity's internal trust that they're issuing a high quality external report. So then we've got, the entities thinking about, well, how do external stakeholders of that user have trust and confidence? So the report needs to be consistent with other external information. And then that last line of defense is the external independent assurance. So what is required in New Zealand is that the primary legislation requires that greenhouse gas emissions included in the statements are assured in accordance with an XRB standard. So we've developed a new greenhouse gas emissions standard, which is accompanied by a basis for conclusion, and so assurance practitioners providing assurance over greenhouse gas emissions under this regime will need to use this standard. The standard has a number of key areas. The first pillar is on engagement requirements. So it requires assurance practitioners to follow one of two internationally recognised standards, either an ISO standard or an ISAE standard. And there's quite a few details as necessary in terms of the engagement. There's some stuff on ethics and independence and quality. There's some very key principles. You know, the ISO standards and ISAE standards have quite different requirements related to ethics and independence. So we've tried to marry them a bit in there. And then there are some quality management requirements. But an important message, I think, regarding assurance for you as project managers is that what we're hearing from the market is that some assurance practitioners are not willing to provide assurance unless an entity has either undergone an internal readiness assessment first, or it has already been disclosing and preparing and disclosing its emissions. So we really encourage, if it is an entity required to get assurance, that they get started right now, and project managers can really help to get entities ready for that emissions reporting. And finally, I said I would talk about guidance. So we issued the standards in December. We issued them in that very principles-based way, and we knew that in doing so, we would need to provide a fair amount of guidance. So we have a number of staff guidance documents. Some of them are really aiming to get entities to think about what primary users are looking for from the disclosure requirements, whereas others are about the mahi, the work underlying the disclosures. So, for example, the scenario analysis. So I really encourage you to have a look at the practical, these documents, because they'll give you information on the practical how to do some of these requirements. I'd emphasise that these staff guidance documents are non-mandatory, and they're all living documents that we're planning on updating as the expectations change and new information becomes available. And I did say, the FMA has other guidance too on their regulatory aspect of the regime. So some key takeaways for you. The standards are here, and we really think project managers can support their implementation. Secondly, assurance is required over greenhouse gas emissions from 2024, so getting ready now is really important. And thirdly, please visit the XRB website. There's a heap of guidance on there, and we're always willing to get feedback on that guidance. So there's a QR code. You can go have a look at the standards on our website, email us at any point, and do please sign up to our website. And I'll stop sharing my screen. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Emily. I think that's a lot to take in. I will now, before I open it up for Q&A, I will wish to ask a panelist to give us. Tony, could you just make some comments on on your views on this matter?
Well, thank you very much, Amelia, and it's wonderful to have XRB to help New Zealand and guide us and the businesses in New Zealand to deliver quality outcomes. And obviously the motivations you've got there are really sound. To have a low emissions climate resilient future is definitely what we're here to do. Local government and some of the project managers may work in local government. Obviously the Local Government Act talks about the 4 well-beings: social, cultural, environment, economic well-being of current and future residents, which is a strong foundation for doing this type of work. We're here to try and manage risks on behalf of the community and understand what the risks are for our organisations, and then of course transition to a low carbon future as well. We've set targets as a Christchurch City Council to be carbon neutral by 2030, and then for the Christchurch City to be carbon neutral by 2045, in line with the Paris agreements. So we're very much in the process of implementing our climate strategy and those targets. And so having a measure to manage approach is really vital for that, but also thinking about risks. Of course, Christchurch City Council is very low lying and flat. And so sea level rise in particular, but also floods and droughts and fires when they come have a big impact on our community. So having a disclosures-based approach is really useful for us to understand what the risks may be for our infrastructure, but also our community, and then what are we doing about those things. So we aren't required to do a disclosures as you've indicated in your list of things. We're not currently required, but we are looking to do it voluntarily, and I'm sure that a number of leading councils throughout New Zealand are doing so as well. I'm aware that Auckland has done several disclosure documents because, of course, they are also an investing organisation that people can invest in. But we're looking to do it for leadership for our community, to show that this is something we need to do, but also to learn the process and understand the standards and guides, so we can deliver best practice for the community in the way we run the council operations. So we're also measuring and managing our footprint. We do a regular monitoring of the Christchurch City footprint, but also the council's footprint, and we report those regularly. And we are, of course, using Toitu to help us do that sort of external verification. That's in fact taking place right now. And we also have, though, the Auditor General is greatly interested in what we're saying in our long-term plans, our 10-year budgeting process. So they are looking to audit councils throughout New Zealand on their climate change considerations, the assumptions, how they're including climate change in their budgets, and how they're taking climate risks into account as they're planning for the future infrastructure of those communities. So that's very well aligned to what you're describing, and that's underway at the moment. Just in terms of the Christchurch City Council, though, just give you some examples of how we're trying to embed climate resilience in our own activities. We have it in our it's a strategic priority for the organisation. So all parts of the organisation have to consider climate resilience. That is both reducing emissions and adaptation. We have it in decision reports. Every decision going up to council, alongside financial and legal risks and impacts on Māori, we have climate resilience impacts. So the council can then make informed decisions every time they see a report. How does this consider emissions and also risks for the community and council? But climate change is also a key driver of our long-term plan, which means that all of the different activities and asset owners across the organisation are considering climate change in their work, looking at issues and opportunities. And we're seeing that as a key driver for our investments in the next 10 years, which is fantastic. It's also in our procurement approach when we're purchasing, as you've indicated, the supply chain. We certainly ask questions of all our suppliers about energy, water, waste, carbon, resilience, but also social outcomes as well. So we're interested in how our suppliers can help us in the journey, and how we can then influence the economy in Christchurch through our procurement decisions. And then we have recently partnered with the Project Management Institute to deliver the Climate and Sustainable Development Project Management Guide, and that includes tools and templates for our staff and hopefully other councils and other areas as well, to better consider climate change and climate resilience as they implement their projects. So it's a really useful guide, and maybe Mokia, you'll share that later. And then we have also invested in some new carbon assessment tools, because we are a very infrastructure-based organisation. So we've developed a specific tool based on Waka Kotahi's their PEAT tool, project emissions estimator tool from Waka Kotahi. We've now got a 3 waters PEAT tool, so that we have horizontal infrastructure, both roads and pipes, the understanding of how those emissions are generated when we're doing that infrastructure, either constructing it or operating it. But also we use brands. They have a wonderful tool called Construct, and you've mentioned already the Ministry of the Environment's look up those workbooks that they have, which are a fantastic place to start as well, as you said. So just sort of a few concluding remarks, I suppose. How can some project managers really help? And from my perspective, I think it's really important to learn about climate change and learn about sustainability and regenerative approaches, so that you can incorporate those things in your work. So it's not just about minimizing emissions, although this is the conversation we're having, but it's also about being much smarter about how we deliver goods and services, and how we can do more with less, and doing less harm as well in that process. Also, use a strong sustainability framework when you're delivering projects. I think it's really important to have that aligned to your organisation or the core values of your customers, and that's why I mentioned the 4 well-beings for local government. If you have a strong sustainability framework, then at least you can apply that in your projects. And then consider regenerative or resilient approaches in the project you're doing, and it takes time to do that. So you need to obviously have that vision at the start of what are we trying to achieve, and then it's really a thought process, thinking about what are the opportunities, what are the issues we need to respond to in this project, and how can we get a better outcome for our community. And then establish KPIs. We've heard a lot about measures, and that's really important, because obviously if you want to measure to manage, if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. So understanding what success looks like is really the key thing there from a project management point of view, getting a sense of what does good look like, what does great look like, and if we're measuring our progress, how can we show and demonstrate that for our customers and our colleagues. And then I think the idea of a collaborative design process is really powerful as well. When you're developing a project, think about the whole of life, and the whole of life costs and benefits and opportunities to enable more informed decision making. So the idea of a collaborative approach, working with stakeholders to understand and look at it from all different aspects, gives you a much better possibility of getting a better outcome for reducing emissions, but also including resilience and other values as well. And then lastly is about sharing your successes and celebrating your challenges. I think it's really important to be able to exchange with others in the project management space, but also just the community and your customers as well. What's done well, what's done poorly, how can we improve next time? Because we often don't evaluate those sorts of things at the end of projects very well, and certainly we don't often share them. So there's some initial thoughts.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Tony, for that. I think that's lots of good feedback and good views as well. Can I call upon Gina to make her comments? Gina, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I believe that the opportunities presented for project managers by climate change and our need to act now is both an exciting and challenging time. From my experience working with a number of local councils and also some independent refuse and recycling companies who are looking to reduce their greenhouse gases and voluntarily report on their final disclosures, some of the behaviours are very immature in relation to the organisational governance responsibilities and climate governance in particular. There seems to be limited people with the right knowledge and not enough understanding of the circular economy and the whole organisational value chain. So understanding, as Amelia said before, the upstream transportation and the distribution of the product once it's left the original organisation. I still think we're seeing climate action as a compliance-related activity rather than a strategic imperative, and I think project managers can really add some value in this space. Many project managers will be familiar with the challenge of governance versus management in a standard project management environment. And I think this is an area where we still need to develop further at an enterprise level for climate governance to ensure buy-in from all key stakeholders. In terms of strategy, I see that organisations can interpret climate change into their current practices, but I think we still have quite a long way to go to have a better understanding of the potential impacts on our businesses through climate-related hazards and being open to understand the uncertainties. Risk management is definitely an area where project managers can help support the development of disclosures, defining a consistent set of standards for use across the organisation and supporting the development of clear processes for identifying, assessing and managing climate-related risks and ensuring those risks are integrated into an enterprise risk management process is fundamental. Again, this is where we are seeing some immaturity and a lack of consistency across organisations. I think traditionally risk management has been about whether something could happen or not, whereas we need to reassess our thinking so we can consider risks across a number of timeframes to fully understand the potential impacts and costs to the organisation. And then finally, in terms of metrics and targets, organisations seem to find it easier to identify targets to aim for. However, the data on industry-based metrics relevant to that particular industry used to measure and manage climate-related risks and opportunities seems harder to come by. And the identification of other key performance indicators used to measure and manage climate-related risks and opportunities seems to be occurring at a really high summary level. So to wrap up, I think project management professionals have significant skills that can contribute to the requirements of the disclosure reporting processes and the necessary governance, management and enterprise processes that are required to enable us to meet our requirements. So I hope the people on the line are willing to take up the challenge and support what the CCSAG is hoping to do here in New Zealand and really raise that maturity so we can meet our targets. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for that. Now, I would like to open up the floor for any questions. Is there, could you either raise your hand or could you just speak up? Is there anybody with any questions? Yes, please, Matthew.
Hi. Yeah, thanks for all your comments. I was involved with one of the largest dairy companies in Australia about 15 years ago. So we were heavily into the greenhouse gas and emissions, being one of the top 50, I guess, energy users at the time. And what we did to begin with is just looked at our power bills and worked out, what sort of energy consumptions and our, I guess, metrics we were working with. I guess the question for Amelia, is that something where people can start from by looking at your energy bills and consumption? Because one of the things that we found, it was about 5 to 10 years worth of program just to get some of our metering in, to really understand some of the, the smaller parts of the business and some of the larger dairy factories. Is that somewhere where people could start? And is there I guess, a time frame of when we would expect our not efficiency, but our data to become more accurate?
Yeah, great question. Thank you, Matthew. So yeah, it's absolutely a place where someone could start. But it's kind of like a horses for courses type thing. So, every entity is going to have a different greenhouse gas emissions profile. And so the key in these disclosures, which is, trying to understand your critical risks and opportunities, is looking then, okay, across, say, the 15 scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions categories, which ones are going to be most material for you? Because there's no point, focusing a whole heap on reducing your waste emissions if actually it's your investments. The bank, Westpac, doesn't really care so much about its waste probably compared to its investments. But for an entity that is a really large energy user, then yeah, their scope 2 emissions, what is their electricity looking like? That's a huge, huge part. And I also really agree with you, don't underestimate the time frames it takes to change some of these, particularly infrastructure related projects, because that's where these disclosures are really trying to help people to look into the future. Because once you lock in, for a dairy company, a boiler, right? You're drying milk, you're deciding on what the technology is going to be for that boiler. That's going to be with you for 10, 20, 30 years. And so trying to look into the future and think, well, what is going to be the right mechanism for us? Is it going to be switching to electricity? Is it going to be switching to, biofuel? Or is it actually changing what we do, changing that kind of fundamental strategic approach. And now I know that, not every entity can become a Nokia, everyone's not going to completely radically change their business model, but, maybe some are. And so that's really about trying to think, using things like, okay, what are the emissions associated with my, my electricity, can actually really open up a much wider conversation. And I really liked what both Tony and Gina were saying about engaging different stakeholders, because getting that diversity of thinking and into really thinking about your strategy is going to open up possibilities that an entity, if it's just focusing on, I need to think just about how I reduce my emissions here, is not going to step back and kind of take account of that bigger picture, is really what this disclosure regime is aiming for.
Yeah, thanks for that, Amelia. And I also just noted on the governance aspect Gina touched on, this would actually be quite a good lever to be able to give project managers more of a tool or more of a flag to bring that conversation in and bring our maturity up. So, 10 points there as well. Thanks.
Excellent. No, yeah, it really is hoping to be, that I think the fact that mandatory reporting, enables people to say, well, I have to have this conversation with you. And, even for entities that aren't in the regime, we're really trying to get people to see, especially because those financial institutions are in, the banks, the insurers, there will be, we are expecting some kind of form of trickle down effect. And that might be, you might have seen the news, IAG, the insurer, has, talked about insurance retreat in certain parts of Wellington and Auckland. But also, we've got other banks like ANZ talking about the fact that they will stop funding, some activities. So it will affect everyone, whether or not they're in or not.
You're on mute, Mokia. Sorry. There you go.
I see one hand up. Ananda, would you like to ask the question, please.
Thank you, Pravinder. Just a quick question around, apologies, it's a dumb question, but obviously this is a pretty good session. Thank you for organizing this, and that gives us an insight on what we need to be doing. From an awareness to the various business partners and the business organizations, I've been operating in the what do you call animal industry, if you'd like, right, and meat industry for a long time now, right? As you can appreciate, this is one of our topmost revenue generating line in New Zealand, right? The scale and the number of players is enormous in New Zealand, right? So the question that I've got for you is, are there any awareness sessions on the compliance requirement being organized for the industry partners, right? Recently, there was field days organized by MPI a few months ago, right? Where all of these industry requirements was also, tabled and discussed. Were there were these showcased in those sessions?
So yeah, great question. So all the entities in the regime know about it. So they either know about it through us, or they know about it because they've been directly engaged with by the FMA. So directly involved entities know about it. And the other thing I would say is that in the scenario analysis, so in the standards, entities at entity level are required to undertake scenario analysis. But what we have been encouraging is that sectors get together to do sector level scenario analysis, because we think that that's really helpful to bridge the gap between these global meta scenarios down to entity specific information. And we started talking about that about a year ago because we had the example of the seafood sector who'd been doing that. And kind of to our surprise, the message went down really, really well, and nearly every sector, in New Zealand has got together and has been doing sector level scenario work. So the agriculture sector is one of them. And there is a whole page on the XRB website. I'll make sure it gets sent to you all, where you can see the progress of all the sectors, and we are hosting all of those sector level scenario documents on the website as well. We've got links to them all. I think the only one that's finished that is not public is the general insurance sector. But those scenario level exercises are designed to be useful to the entities, but also we're encouraging, again, that diversity of thinking being brought in, so entities who might not necessarily be involved. So using that level, there are umbrella organisations, there are other entities in there. They can then talk at a sector level about, what is happening for their sector. So we have been focusing on the entities who are required to report, but we think that sector level scenario work is a really useful way to get a conversation started at a sector level about, what does climate change mean for us? What are the disclosure requirements? And also for sectors to look across each other. So, agriculture really needs to look at transport, and energy really needs to look at transport, and energy needs to look at agriculture, and those types of things. So again, they're not a one and done exercise. We're really hoping that they'll be done on a kind of regular basis. And also what seafood did, which some other sectors are also now looking to do, is you do the scenario work, and then you think kind of on that transition planning side, it's that, okay, well, how are we going to deal with what we've learned? So some are doing adaptation planning, and some are looking to do transition planning as well.
Yeah, you're 100% right. And the more you understand the agriculture industry, you'll figure out that almost every industry is connected, right? It's not in silos, right? It's a huge setup, right? So there's a fair bit of conversations that need to that need to occur to make this a reality, right? And it's heavily regulated, right, by various business units, if I were to call them so for now, right? So there's a fair amount of change that has to be managed to achieve the desired outcomes. But thank you for, I'll look forward for your link for, and then we'll take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ananda. I see two hands raised, Gina and Vinay. Shall I give Vinay a chance first, Gina? Okay, Vinay, please carry on, Vinay.
Oh, thank you. Probably Gina would like to add to the answer of Amelia. Probably she could go first. That's all right. Thanks.
Okay, Gina.
Oh, sorry, I was going to go off on a completely different tangent. So if you want to ask your questions, then I'll go off on my tangent because it's a little bit different.
Yes.
No?
Vinay, you want to
Okay.
carry on? Sorry. Vinay, you want to ask first, Vinay?
Oh, yes, please. Yeah, I would like to ask if there are, if we could share some recent big projects where project management has played a crucial role in reporting as well as the sustainability aspects of it. So if you could share a few major projects in the recent past, please. Thanks.
Yes, Amelia.
Oh.
Yeah, sorry.
So projects that have been relating to the reporting
Disclosure,
or the disclosure. Oh, well, I guess anyone's disclosure, to be honest, is a major project. I think it's really interesting. We've started, so as you may know, the energy sector in New Zealand has been doing a lot of disclosure for a long time. Like this kind of thinking has been really key and important for them. So it's interesting to look at their disclosures because I think they show the evolution over time in terms of the more sophistication of the types of information that they're looking, to do. But then I think it's interesting we're starting to see some voluntary disclosure from some new entities. So PAMU, who you might have known as Landcorp, but they've just released their disclosures. So I think it's interesting to have a look at theirs as a voluntary one. But in terms of projects, I think, as Tony mentioned, Auckland Council is a disclosing entity because they issue listed debt. So actually, it's not out yet, unfortunately. But I'm super, super excited to see theirs because I think they must be one of the most complex entities in the regime. And just thinking about how they have gone about attacking it as a project. We've talked to them quite a bit, but I can't talk to you about what they've said to us, unfortunately. But I do know that what I do know is that nearly every entity has gone, oh, I'd love a project plan. Can you please give us a project plan to how to do this? And we've kind of said, well, we can't because it's new and it's all different and, it's all specific to your entity. But I actually would really love someone in this community maybe to publish a project plan next year or the year after that says, hey, here are some useful ways to get into this work. The XRB, we are doing our own voluntary reporting against this, and so we're doing, we've had to start, and we have policy officials trying to do project planning. It's not been the most efficient project. But so I guess I can't really give you a core example of a project, but apart from to say that they are all massive projects.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, yes.
In terms of responding to that question, obviously it's the organizations themselves that need to disclose, and it's not at a project level, it's at an organizational level. But of course, councils are, through the setting of targets, whether it's for the community or for the councils, needing to measure and manage their emissions through projects, the way they deliver infrastructure, and the way we deliver roading and all these sorts of things. So, that's a work in motion right now. So all the projects that Waka Kotahi are doing, the large ones, of course, have all sorts of measures around them. The Green Roads approach and the PEAT model that I just described, the project emissions estimator tool, Waka Kotahi are using to help understand the footprint, at least, of that infrastructure. But it's also another question about the risks and the opportunities, because I think don't forget the opportunities in this as well. When we're building something new, there's a whole lot of opportunities that's presented by that. So it's not just about avoiding risks and avoiding emissions. It's about saying, how can we make this a better project for the community? So anyway, there's lots of different projects that are all being measuring their footprints and exploring risks. I'm sure risk management processes is just built into normal project management anyway. So, and the disclosures is for an organizational level.
And Vinay, actually, we are releasing our project managers toolkit. So I think if you go to our site, you can get a copy of that to see how it can be done. But then, of course, we haven't yet talked about the disclosures over there, but then from that toolkit, I think it may not be too hard to get the disclosure information out. Gina, you please, Gina.
So Amelia, this might be a bit of a weird question, but and I'm going to read it because I want to take a subset of the standards and then ask you a question based on that, if that's okay. So the standard states that where the governance body sets, monitors progress against and oversees achievement of metrics and targets for managing climate-related risks and opportunities, including whether, and if so how, related performance metrics are incorporated into remuneration policies. So I was really interested because we often see in the project management world quite low maturity in terms of governance. And so I'm really interested, is there any HR guidance on around incorporating remuneration policies into the governance of these type of activities, or is it up to the individual organisation?
Yeah, great question, Gina. That was a very controversial one, remuneration, whether or not we should keep that in or not. Some people thought no. We decided to keep it in. We got strong feedback that people wanted it. So it is about every entity making their own decisions. So to clarify, the entity could absolutely say, no, we don't do that. There's no requirement that an entity incorporates climate into remuneration. So the disclosure would just be, we don't do that. And that is a perfectly acceptable disclosure. If they do, then yeah, it's about, do they do bonuses? Do they do base pay? Do they think about particular, we're talking about projects. Is it about the delivery of a certain project that then would, lead into the remuneration? So it's for every entity to think about how they might do it. There are a whole heap of remuneration disclosures that often in other jurisdictions that entities could look for. It's not something that we have seen that is super common here in New Zealand. So again, I would probably not expect to see a heap of remuneration linked to climate change here. It is something you often see in cultures where there are significant, bonuses, like in the US, etc. So I would probably look to see what the disclosures might be from some voluntary US entities, if you're looking to think about that remuneration one. But it's really kind of the reason why we kept it in was it's a bit, you're putting your money where your mouth is, and that's why people wanted to see it in there.
Thank you for that. And I think certainly, from I spend my life looking at projects and programs, and I think some raising a maturity in the governance space would be helpful. And so having some targets, or not like levers that people could pull, or organisations could pull, I think would be absolutely fantastic, which is why I probably latched onto it. Yeah,
and you might be interested. So for those of you who don't know, there is an initiative called Chapter Zero, and that is an initiative through the Institute of Directors in New Zealand is the New Zealand member of Chapter Zero. And they are producing heaps of information actually aimed specifically at directors to try and upskill them and increase their capability, because ultimately it is them who is signing off the disclosures. There's actually just been something coming out from one of the law firms around directors' duties and climate. So if you do have, you're talking at director level, I really would encourage them to look at that director duty requirement, and to look at the stuff coming out of the IOD.
Perfect, thank you.
Just to add to that, there's a climate change group as part of that Directors Institute as well. So that's similar to what you're doing here with the project managers group. There's a climate specific group as well. But I just want to add on, I think the key point here, I think, is around roles and responsibilities, making sure that someone in the organization is over this. You've got the support at a high level, and you are assigning tasks and roles to throughout the organization, so that everyone has a role to play. Because I think quite often we look at these things, it's just the risk manager, or it's just the climate team, or it's just someone else. But actually, throughout the organizations, if you're a large organization, whether you're a lawyer or a communicator or a designer or an engineer, whatever it may be, you've got a role to play in this journey. And so trying to engage the organization, show that leadership at the top, get the organization really aligned around the risks and the opportunities to be a climate smart organization, and then making sure that someone is over it, accountable, and is going to deliver it for the organization.
Thank you, Tony. So we have now just time for one more question. Anybody from the floor has any burning views or burning issues? Okay. If not, I really appreciate Amelia for a presentation, and Tony, and now so we have one hand up. Okay, yes, no, it's a clapping. But so it's my view, which I haven't given my view actually. I think we have a fair number of really passionate about sustainability, and I think that's one area where perhaps PMINZ and XRB can see how we can work in future in order to train the project managers more into this disclosure area. I'll catch up with Emily on that. But the other thing which came out, which Ananda talked about, Tony talked about, and Gina talked about, it is the main decision makers. It is from the top. So unless the top people understand the issues, understand the benefits, and understand the need of it, so I think that's where we need to advocate, that the requirement is set by the people at the top, saying this is what we want to do. So through XRB and through other channels, I think it's very, very important to reach the key decision makers to insist